the rest of you. I appreciate the invitation, and it's a pleasure to talk to you. I will be talking today about a certain theme of American literature that's very important, especially in the 19th century, and that influenced our culture and still influences our culture, as was seen by recent events on January 6th when so there was an insurrection at our Capitol building. People thinking they were acting very self-reliantly against the government. This is a strain in a theme of our literature and our culture. So I'm going to be talking about that. I will be supplementing what Katie said on Monday, if some of you are there for that. But otherwise, I'll just stick to this theme. I will share my screen now and just go through a PowerPoint, but feel free to interrupt with questions. So that's who I am. I am David Hicks. I was born here in New York, and I went to college upstate and then at New York University in New York City. And I lived and worked most of my life in New York, but then I moved to Colorado and I lived in the mountains. I lived in Colorado for 20 years in this mountain town, and in Denver. And then very recently, I moved to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where I am now, where I have a new job. Last year, things were very hectic for me. This is 6 months of last year. I first, in late January, went to the Czech Republic, and then the pandemic happened. You may remember that in March, and I moved back to Denver. But while I was in the Czech Republic, I got a new job. So in June, I moved from Denver to Wilkes-Barre. So I was 2,000 miles or so about 3,200 kilometers. So there's been a lot of moving in my life last year. This is the Faculty of the Arts building where I had my office and where I met a few of you and taught you. And this is my office building now. This is where I'm sitting right now. This is in Wilkes-Barre, Connecticut. It's a beautiful building. This essentially is my whole office here, and these apartments are empty, so I really have the whole building. And this may look a little bit like Prague with the Tava River, but it's not. It's the Susquehanna River in Wilkes-Barre. And you can tell because there are no beautiful buildings here. Instead, Wilkes-Barre is a rather ugly town. It used to be a very industrial town, but it's a beautiful river, and my office is right down here on the bottom. And this is my wife and I, Cynthia and I, at that little island near Campa Moslegui, I think it's the bridge there. It's under that bridge. So, and this is where I lived. This is my favorite neighborhood ever in my life, right near Stromovka Park. And that was my favorite thing about living in Prague, to take a walk every morning, as I was just telling Hanka. Every morning, a walk or run, even if it was raining, it was just beautiful. And I watched spring come very slowly before I had to leave. So we're talking about self-reliance today, and it's a curious word, self-reliance. It just means to trust yourself or to depend on yourself instead of the government or family or teachers or any institution, church. And it's a very popular phrase in the 19th century, especially with Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1841. I will talk about him. And it's an element of romantic movement that Katie talked about on Monday. And it really it's not an original American, no literary movement was original to the United States. It was all borrowed from Europe or England. And this comes mostly from Immanuel Kant and Hegel, German philosophers who were reacting against Lockean philosophy by basically saying, yes, we learn things through our senses and we use reason, yes, but there's also a different sense or intuition that's more important, that transcends the rest, that surpasses the other senses. And that's why the movement's called Transcendentalism. It's a very big word. It basically means my intuition, my conscience, my my God within me, that sense of self transcends institutions, laws, anything else that you can tell me is right or wrong. I know what's right or wrong within me. And if I follow that, I'm being self-reliant and therefore truthful. It's a very inspiring philosophy. It's still in our culture today. But it's also a very difficult philosophy because it leads to selfishness. And you know, if we tell everybody to trust themselves, to trust what they think rather than what other people say, then it leads to people like Hitler and, you know, or Donald Trump, or, you know, people who do things the way they think is right instead of following the law or trusting in public opinion, or a balance of the two. So we'll talk about how this came about, because this was not unique to the 19th century. In fact, it has its beginnings in the very earliest of the colonies writing, the colonist writing, colonial literature. Colonial literature in the 1600s was really letters and pamphlets that the colonists sent home to England. Well, first I should say, in the native literature, which is really oral, it's really not written literature, it was oral stories. There was no real self-reliant theme because it was so tribal. Native cultures, native storytellers, everything was very very tribal, about the community. The communities raised children together, moved together, were very mobile, protected each other against one another. But it's not until the English come that we get this kind of self-reliance theme. And it's funny because they're supposed to come to this new world for the crown, for England, and to make money for England, and to maybe Christianize, to convert the savages, the devils, the natives to Christianity. But in fact, their letters back home were filled with not those themes, but the theme of, you can get rich here. You can have a new life here. You can, just by working hard, you could make money and be independent from those annoying rules of England. So the themes we find in this literature and these letters, and by the way, the most informative letters we have are from John Smith, who's sort of famous for the Pocahontas story. But John Smith is the one who founded the Virginia colony. In 1607, Virginia was named after Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, Virginia, right in here. And then 13 years later was the Plymouth colony right here in Massachusetts Bay. So these are colonial writings back home. And the purpose of these writings was to get more people to come over because everybody died when on the boat, or half the people died on the boat or when they arrived. So we really needed, the colonists needed more bodies. So they were promoting the New World. They were advertising, they were marketing. So that's why we call it promotional literature, because they were promoting this new world. And part of the promotion was to say, you could be virtuous here. And by virtue, they meant virtu, the truthful. You could be manly, virility, veracity. You could be truthful and manly here, not necessarily pious. You could prosper here. You could make a lot of money from the minerals we have here in this new world, natural resources. There's an abundance of fish and fowl and things to eat and kill. You have plenty to eat, and you could be free to do whatever you want here. You can take some land, It doesn't matter if the natives have it, we'll just kill them or we could just take them. So from the beginning, it was a very arrogant, very aggressive philosophy. But the truth was that when they got here, I mean, they were miserable. The weather was terrible. It was very hard to farm, especially in the Northeast. So from the very beginning, you could say, quote unquote, American literature or colonial literature was a lie, or partly a lie, partly true. So here is the one line from John Smith's letter. Here every man may be master and owner of his own labor and land. If he have nothing but his hands, he may by industry, by hard work, quickly grow rich. So that's the kind of myth of America. That's the American dream right there. It's the beginning of the American dream in 1609, I think it was, or 1615, right around that period. Work hard, make a lot of money, and have a better life for your children. In reality, when people got there, all the work was done for the public good. John Smith had a rule that if you don't work, you don't eat. And sometimes if you're sick with cholera or consumption, tuberculosis, you couldn't work, so you didn't eat, and then you died. So it was a very harsh philosophy. It was a very communal philosophy that if you don't work, you don't eat. So in reality, many colonists died. So he didn't mention that in his letters. He didn't talk about how everybody was dying. So the important point here is that self-reliance, this idea of self-reliance, of being your own master, from the very, very beginning, is a half lie, half truth. The American dream, in other words, has always been part myth and part reality. It is true that some people did get rich when they came over here and worked hard, but it's also true that most people suffered, and it was very difficult to make a living by yourself, being self-reliant. In fact, you could say that this element of self-reliance is why the famous colony, Plymouth colony, the one that's famous for Thanksgiving, that holiday, failed. This is Plymouth right here in this bay. The Mayflower came here to a beautiful town called Provincetown, my favorite place to be, and then came here, which is a much more difficult place to farm. And the second in 1630, Massachusetts Bay Colony was here, and that became Boston. That was successful, but this one was not successful, even though it's mythologized as being successful. And we know this because the governor of this colony, William Bradford, took notes and wrote a journal. And he mentioned the reasons why the colony did not work out. And some of them are obvious, like starvation and disease and waging wars against the native tribes that were there, even though most of them were very peaceful and very helpful. But they kept grabbing more land. They kept just taking more land from the natives until those wars started. So, but really, most of the problem was that if people did do well, then they just wanted more. They wanted to be more self-reliant. They wanted to move away from the town and the church and the governor and get their own land so they could govern themselves. And human nature, people are naturally self-reliant, or they want to be free when they're young and independent. Or think of the people who came over on the boats. They were mostly either prisoners or young men and women who did not have a job or an apprenticeship, and they wanted to be on your own. The one thing you want to do when you're a teenager is you want to be on your own, free, but you don't necessarily know how to do that well. And so we got a lot of people in the colonies who acted badly, who drank a lot, or who traded weapons with the natives, or they committed crimes, petty crimes. And what Bradford says, he doesn't use the word self-reliant, but he says too many people just wanted to be, to govern themselves. And that's why the colony failed. That brings us to the 18th century, where this theme of self-reliance finds its way into market culture. in Philadelphia particularly. So this is when Philadelphia, which is just a little south of me, about over 2 hours. It's about from like Prague to Brno. It's I'm about 2.5 hours from New York and Philadelphia, where I am right now. Philadelphia became so popular. This is when the colonies went from 50,000 people to 350,000. And Philadelphia became the third largest city in the British Empire, behind London and Liverpool. Philadelphia was a very busy city, and it was dominated by a single figure, Ben Franklin, who in his autobiography later in his life depicted himself as coming to Philadelphia as a completely self-reliant young man, arriving in the city with only a loaf of bread. That's it. That's all he had, was a loaf of bread. And then when he got here, when he got to Philadelphia, he burned the oil in his building late at night so people would think he's working, even though he wasn't. So he created this myth of himself as this kind of hardworking, industrious, self-reliant man, when in fact he did arrive with a loaf of bread, but there was a trunk, a suitcase full, a boat full of his possessions on the river coming the next day. So from the beginning, Franklin was a very industrious and amazing citizen of the colonies and then of the United States. And he did so much for the public good, including first public library, this Franklin stove, bifocals, of course, electricity, you know about that, lightning rod, daylight savings, which annoys me, but was important at the time to save oil, lamps on the streets, gutters in the roads so that the rain would wash away to the side, the first fire company, et cetera, et cetera. He's an amazing man, but also part myth. Nobody really knew him very well, but he was the most popular person in the United States. In fact, he probably would have been our first president if he was not sick at the time when it came time to elect our first president. When George Washington was elected, he was sick. Franklin was sick, and then he died soon afterwards. And he, in his autobiography, describes his project of moral perfection. He was going to eliminate all his flaws one at a time. So in other words, he was a self-reliant, mythologized person. Half of it true, but also most of his self-reliance, most of his inventions and work were done for public good. So this is a kind of combination of the Puritans of the 17th century and early 18th century, the Puritan emphasis on community and the colonies' emphasis on community. You could not worship as you pleased. You could not, I mean, the rules were very rigid. It was a combination of that kind of society that formed American culture very early on and is still with us today, this fear of public opinion and this fear of breaking the law. At the same time, he also taps into this self-reliance, the strain of self-reliance. So he does both. And it seems to me that that's the best of both worlds, to feel confident and self-reliant, but also to do things for others. I mean, it seems like that's what we end up relying on, but in the 19th century, it became almost all self-reliance. So we're in the 1700s now, and the two most important documents in American society are the Declaration of Independence, which has some language about community or equality, right? All men are created equal, but also this kind of self-reliant language that every one of us can pursue happiness, which is a bizarre notion for forming a society based on pursuing happiness. It's very strange to have that in the Declaration, and that later this was copied by the French and the Irish and other declarations of such. And that whenever any government destroys my pursuit of happiness, I can abolish it. Again, very strange, but we see evidence of this still in our culture. At the same time, the Constitution, which was written 10 years later and ratified in 1790, has more communal language, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, provide for the common defense, promote general welfare, right? Also has in the First Amendment very kind of self-reliant language. I can say whatever I want, like free speech, free right to assemble, petition the government for any complaint I have. That's very kind of individualistic. So our two main documents in our culture are written with this kind of conflict between public good and individual rights. And that conflict was written about in Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, a Frenchman who visited this new country in 1830s and wrote that these people, Americans, pretended to be independent, but they're really afraid of public opinion. That, by the way, comes from the Puritans, who believe they're predestined, saved or damned before birth. So they were constantly paranoid and worried, and that other people were saved and they were not. So there's a great fear of what everybody thought of you in the community. And I know this is true of many societies. This isn't unique to the United States or the colonies of the United States. Absolutely true for all societies. It's especially true, though, for the United States because of the Puritans and the colonists and the kind of people who came over to populate, to colonize this land. They were more independent-minded, but they were also immature about it and didn't really know what they were doing. De Tocqueville said that liberty is not the object of their desires. Equality is their idol. They worship equality. They want to be normal. They are not independent thinkers at all. In fact, if everybody's equal, if all men are created equal, it's really difficult to be independent because you're so worried about being equal. When in fact, according to de Tocqueville, we are not all equal. Some of us are better than others, or naturally, or more intelligent, or more industrious, or whatever. But people are not all equal, and we shouldn't give some people the same rights as others. That's according to de Tocqueville. He said that, boy, is this true, that Americans were choosing leaders badly because once you pick a representative government and you have Congress and you have representation in government, then you don't know how to manage your own affairs, and so you give up your right. And people who do that can't possibly choose good leaders. And then he noticed there's a clash between democracy, individualism, and representation, and socialism from the Puritans. That democracy extends the sphere of individual freedom, right? It gives everybody the right to vote and make decisions and run for office and to make their own decisions. Socialism, however, restricts it. And what they both have in common is equality. And he wasn't saying this in a complimentary way. He said that this is too confusing for Americans to sort of have both democratic traits and socialist traits. It ends up being mediocre. It ends up being boring. So in the 19th century, in part as reaction to this and to Lockean philosophy and to what Katie talked about as the Age of Enlightenment, the 18th century, where people like Ben Franklin and other, especially in England, were writing social novels of social manners, and like if you think of Alexander Pope or Dryden or Swift, like the world is very well ordered. There's God, there's the angels, there's humans, there's animals and insects. The 19th century, in reaction to that, brought about Romanticism, which the writers of which espoused or proposed or wrote that we should actually follow our feelings. If you think of Goethe, if you ever read Goethe, the Faust stories of Goethe or other German writers, and the English Wordsworth, Byron Shelley, Keats, these are all writers who promoted nature and emotion triumphing over, and intuition triumphing over order, society, because we feel most alive when we follow our natural instincts. This is kind of ushered in, and I know, by the way, my dates are different from Katie's. Katie's was more general. Everybody has different dates for these movements. I'm dating it from 1819 because that's when Washington Irving published the sketchbook and American literature changed. Irving was borrowing from German writer Peter Gent and other German and English writers, Sir Walter Raleigh, but he made it distinctly American at a time when there was no distinct American literature, really, except for James Fenimore Cooper. Most of it was British imitations. But Rip Van Winkle is distinctly American. He's an American figure in New York State and just walks away from home, falls asleep for 20 years. And that's the beginning of the Romantic movement in our country, even though it's later than most countries. Romantic writers rejected society institutions for personal will or whim or whimsy, impulse. There's an emphasis on intuition rather than society, and very democratic. The thinking of Romantic writers is that if God created us, and God then is within us, created us in his image, God is therefore inside us, so we need not see God as a kind of strange celestial being. In fact, God is within us. Therefore, if we just follow ourselves, our instincts, our consciences, then we are following God. We are then self-reliant as opposed to distant God-reliant. The Puritans were already kind of doing this by saying that ultimately you have to believe in the Bible and believe in God, but you have to follow your own faith to be saved. You have to trust your faith, your individual faith, not family or community. It was you, your faith, your Bible that saves you or not. So it was a God reliance, but it was within you. And the Romantics just switched the emphasis over to the self instead of God, but believing that it was the same thing. That if you rely on yourself, you will be happy, truthful, good, divine, even, which is very lofty, but that's what they believed. And these people were called Transcendentalists eventually because of that intuition transcending other senses. And they were also believers of self-reform. We could always change all the time. If there is one characteristic of the American self, the American character, the national character, it is that we love change. We always change. We can't wait to change from Obama to Trump to Biden. Like we just constantly go back and forth between like extreme philosophies, or you know, this is a culture that had people leaving to find gold or changing locations. We live far apart from our families. We are constantly moving and changing. It's not necessarily good for society, but it is interesting. The principal spokesperson for the Romantic movement in American literature is Ralph Waldo Emerson. You cannot think of a major American writer, male, female, or slave, that was not in some way, who was literate, who read, who did not in some way respond to either an agreement or disagreement with Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was the most popular lecturer of his generation. And lectures, public speeches, were the main form of entertainment in the 19th century. People would show up on a Friday night for lectures. Emerson became famous when he wrote Nature in 1836, which was a celebration, kind of a Wordsworthian celebration of how we are most ourselves when we are our most natural selves, not in institutions, but in nature. But he became most controversial, if you will, or appealing and very popular when he published Self-Reliance in 1841. Self-Reliance has a lot of quotable one-liners saying the same thing over and over, which is to trust thyself, trust yourself, trust oneself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. So like a harp or a piano string, if you pluck the string of the self, every other heart in the world vibrates to it, because when you trust yourself, you are speaking the truth, and that is everybody else is sympathetic to it, even if they're afraid to say the same thing. It's like when we see a good speech and we nod our head or applaud, they're usually saying something we believe, but we're afraid to say. And the antagonist to self-reliance is society. Society is a conspiracy against the manhood, the virility, right, the virtue of every one of its members. So society is the enemy. Trusting myself is the ally. And if you want to be a man, if you want to be an adult, if you want to be truthful and virile and virtuous, you have to be a non-conformist. You do not conform. You do not agree with and live according to the rules of society. In fact, you must disobey the rules to be a real person. That's how bold this philosophy is. And what is sacred is not the church or parents or school or anything, but the integrity, the truthfulness of your own mind, the integrity of your own mind. Because what society calls good or bad changes. When I was young, homosexuality was evil, interracial marriage, marijuana, and now they're all accepted. Now they're all fine, right? In most places. So you can't trust society. You can't trust popular opinion because they're always changing. So you have to trust yourself. This is self-reliance. This is the important part of our talk today. From now on, until the Civil War in 1861, for the next 20 years, and then beyond that, certainly, Emerson influences other writers, almost every other writer. The most well-known of his influences are Henry David Thoreau, who wrote his famous essay on civil disobedience, advocating that it's one's duty to disobey the law if the law is unjust. This is something that Gandhi read and followed. This is something that Nelson Mandela read and agreed with. So it's a very influential essay, but he's just really borrowing from Emerson. Thoreau was Emerson's gardener. They were very good friends. They lived in the same town. Emerson was 14 years, I think, older. So he's kind of the older brother figure or father figure. But Thoreau takes what Emerson says and actually applies it to his work and his life. So we should never give in our conscience to the majority because our conscience is right. The majority is usually wrong. So we should, if the law is unjust, we should disobey it, which of course is what Martin Luther King Jr. did in the Civil Rights Movement, to disobey unjust segregation laws in the United States. Not to violently, I think Thoreau wasn't advocating violence, he was advocating disobedience, civil disobedience. So this is where it comes from. It comes from Thoreau, but it originates in Emerson. And then he wrote his famous book, Waldo, which nobody read at the time, but some people did in Boston, but it wasn't very popular but now everybody reads. Every American student reads it or tries to read it. um, and that's based on his experiment by living in a cabin in the woods in Walden Pond, which, by the way, was just a mile from the center of town. It wasn't off in the wilderness. It was right there in town. He would walk into town almost every day and have a piece of pie and read the newspaper. He wasn't living in complete solitude, in other words, but he did create the myth of doing that symbolically to make his point, which is that being away from society gives you a perspective on society, and you could see how misguided it is and how the best way to live is independent of that, to be self-reliant, to grow your own food, to entertain yourself, to not need money. And now, you know, his quotes are on posters all over the world. To follow your dreams and you will be happy. And then, of course, Walt Whitman, who very differently from any British writers, published poetry which was shocking at the time. And the main poem being Song of Myself. That is incredibly arrogant and selfish, and it's beautiful. The poem begins, I celebrate myself and sing myself. Very bizarre, and if you look at his image on the frontispiece, I've enlarged it right here. This is from 1855. This is his first book. He self-published it and sold it himself in New York. If you look at his pose and his clothing, it's very different from, let's say, look at Emerson, look at Thoreau's clothing, his tie, and look at Emerson's, the way he's dressed. This is the way men dressed back then. But look at Whitman. He's saying, I don't really care how you think I should dress. This is how I'm going to be. I'm going to be myself. I'm going to be your companion, and I'm going to celebrate my own beauty. Whitman was alive when photography was invented, and he loved taking pictures of himself. He was the first selfie addict. He really liked being photographed. So that changes American poetry completely. Before Whitman, it was very British poets and very formulaic. After Whitman, if you look at the lines and how loose they are, free verse, it changes poetry from that point on. And then the popular works are usually dismissed because they're sentimental, but they're actually really good. And I strongly recommend reading the women writers of the 19th century. They're wonderful. And here are three that promote self-reliance in their characters as either influenced by Emerson or influenced by the movement. Cedric's Hope Leslie is about a girl who acts a lot like Huck Finn later in the century, who grows up as a Puritan, but disobeys the Puritan governors to save a native girl from death, or tries to. And Fanny Fern is the pen name of the most popular newspaper writer in America. And nobody's heard of her because she's a woman, but she was a feminist. She was a terrific writer, really funny. So that's her pen name, and her book is Ruth Hall, and it's autobiographical. It's about a woman who is very poor, who really starving, and learned how to write better, and then became a best-selling feminist newspaper columnist. And the book significantly, unlike other books of that era, ends with her being independent, not married. And then Edie Ann Southwick's wonderful book, The Hidden Hand, features a very independent, self-reliant girl named Capitola Black. And also, the captivity narratives of the 17th century, most notably by Mary Rowlandson, and the 19th century slave narratives, you wouldn't think that self-reliance was applicable to, or adoptable by anybody who wasn't a white male, right? Women, African Americans. How could you tell them to be self-reliant when they couldn't even vote and they had no rights? but the spirit of self-reliance is in their works and their narratives, which are remarkable publications because it was illegal to teach slaves to read and write. So we find in Mary Rowlandson's, who's supposed to be obeying the Bible and getting saved from her captivity by Indians through her faith. Instead, we see her stealing food from her captors and using her wits to get her own safety, to engineer her own safety. And Frederick Douglass is supposedly praying, but he really talks about how self-reliance is what saved him. He taught himself to read and write with no help from anybody else. He tricked children into teaching them how to write, and he physically fought the slave overseer in order to be free. He had an epic fight with his overseer and won, and the overseer never punished him after that, and later he was able to be freed. Harriet Jacobs is someone you might not have heard of, but it's my favorite of the slave narratives. She's a remarkable woman who was going to be raped or kept as a mistress by her master, but kept avoiding him, and then got a friend of hers to impregnate her because she knew that the social mores of the time would prevent the master from having sex with her if she were pregnant. Like the rules of a society would overcome his own lust. So she actually used her body, the only thing she had. She's a beautiful 13, 14-year-old, just a girl, but she became pregnant twice, had 2 children, and then hid from her master, who still wanted to rape her, hid in her grandmother's attic. But it wasn't even an attic, it was a garret. If you look at the bottom right, it was this size, so you couldn't stand up, and she lived there for 7 years. She lived in this space for 7 years with ants and rats, watching her children through a hole in the wall until she was freed, until she escaped. So remarkable stories of self-reliance through the slave narratives. But then an important counter argument against self-reliance comes from Nathaniel Hawthorne, who is a contemporary of Emerson. You could see that they grew up at the same time and came of age the same time. In fact, Hawthorne married a woman who was a big fan of Emerson, Sophia Peabody. Emerson's greatest admirer became Hawthorne's wife. So Hawthorne was always a little bit envious of Emerson and ended up making fun of him in his works a little bit, making fun of the philosophy of self-reliance. Then Thoreau and Whitman are contemporaries of Melville. They all are of the same age. And Melville ended up being very critical of self-reliance. And Rebecca Harding Davis, who was a big fan of Hawthorne's, she also wrote works in the 19th century that were critical of self-reliance. So in their short stories, for example, Young Goodman Brown, you might know, Bartleby, Melville's story, and Rebecca Harding Davis's Life in the Iron Mills, which is about poor people in the iron mills in the industrial era in West Virginia. So they write about people who try to be self-reliant, who do what their conscience tells them to do, but then end up absolutely miserable, either in prison, dead, or miserable, because they were not thinking of others. They were thinking only of themselves, or they were inspired by some Emersonian preacher. They also wrote novels. Hawthorne's A Scarlet Letter, Melville's Moby Dick, Davis's Margaret House, about the harsh consequences to self and others of following one's impulse and going against society's rules. Dimmesdale in The Scarlet Letter, Ahab does what he wants and kills everybody on the ship. Margaret House, same thing, brings misery to others by attempting to be self-reliant. And psychological tales like Ethan Brand from Hawthorne, Melville's great book, Pierre, which nobody reads. It's a very difficult book, but it's a great book. and it's a very good story called The Wife Story by Rebecca Harding Davis, about the results of what Hawthorne calls the chain of breaking the chain of humanity, being selfish, committing the unpardonable sin of thinking only of yourself, and the cold-heartedness that results from that, of not caring for others, only yourself. So they're almost morality tales against Emersonian philosophy. And Emerson was reading them, and Thoreau was reading them, and not really enjoying them. But and the three were friends. Hawthorne, Emerson, and Thoreau were friends. They were ice skating together in Concord. They drank together. Hawthorne and Melville were friends. Hawthorne and Davis met each other. So they all knew each other and read each other, but they were on I don't want to say that they were completely critical of self-reliance, because there's an appeal to the self-reliant characters in their stories, and Dimsdale and Hester Prynne and Ahab. They're very appealing characters, but ultimately they bring people to ruin. So the Civil War, I'm gonna end quickly now and take questions. But the Civil War changes everything. After this, the ugliest war that was imaginable in 1861, 1865, our literature changes from romantic to more realistic. The struggles of individuals against the forces of society, the struggle to be self-reliant, and when self-reliance is now a joke. You can't do what you want because look what just happened. And by the way, slaves can't do what they want, so we need to free them. But if you encourage self-reliance, then you encourage insurrection, right? And you don't have a country anymore. That leads us to I'll just give you a couple examples of realism that use self-reliance. One is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a famous American story where Huck knows that he's supposed to turn in, give away the fact that Jim is a slave, and he's supposed to write to the slave owner and tell her that he's found Jim, Jim has run away, and he knows that he'll go to heaven if he turns in the slave, because according to the Bible, slaves are supposed to obey your earthly masters in Ephesians, right? But he has a moment of conscience when after he writes the letter, and in a very famous scene, he says, all right then, I'll go to hell, and he tears up the letter. We see this as a good thing because he's following his conscience rather than society, but Huck knew he was going against Southern society law. And then another symbolic moment in terms of self-reliance was when he comes at the end, he comes back to town and he's got money and he's got a place to live. And he says, Aunt Sally, she's going to adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've got a light out for the territory. This becomes the reason why Ernest Hemingway called Huckleberry Finn the most important American novel, because it's the theme of leaving society. Rip Van Winkle, Jack Kerouac, this whole theme of running away from society becomes the theme of American culture with Clint Eastwood and John Wayne, all these kinds of characters who leave society and become self-reliant. The other example I want to give you is Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who, as a woman and bisexual, in the 19th century, very difficult, formed her own magazine called The Forerunner, and she really wrote everything in the magazine. She wrote almost all the articles and was the editor and publisher. And she wrote the famous story, Yellow Wallpaper, of a woman who was had postpartum depression, but was given a sleep cure by men because she must be crazy if she didn't want to be a good mother. And wrote 2 books, Women in Economics and Herland, about how women should run society and how there should be things called daycare centers, so where children could be cared for by the community, not by every individual woman. So she was a very good self-reliant person and writer, but her self-reliance was always for the public good. She always had, like Ben Franklin, she had the public in mind. all the time. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman is an important figure. And then you may not have heard of her, but Kalasa, Gertrude Simmons, where she was known by, was a South Dakota native who became a, instead of a dutiful Indian, she became a very celebrity. She was beautiful, so she was photographed almost as a model, and she used her popularity and her skills. She was a concert violinist. Whenever she performed, to help the Indian cause. So you can see this ad here in her later years. She helped Indians help themselves. So self-reliance for the public good in Native culture. So this is how self-reliance kind of continues. Then we hit, in literature, we hit the age of realism with like Huck Finn and Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And also modernism, which we could spend another hour on, but this is when self-reliance kind of slowly dies in literature because people who try to be self-reliant are squelched. Realism is when it's stories about individuals struggling against social forces. Naturalism, or Emile Zola calls it naturalisme, that's why we got it. It's not about nature, it's about how the natural state of humans is crushed by society, religion, nature itself. Everything is conspiring. The individual doesn't just struggle against that. The individual is destroyed by society. So the endings of naturalistic novels like McTeague, Frank Norris, Kate Chopin's The Awakening, which Katie mentioned, the main characters are dead or ruined. You probably heard of Native Son. You probably haven't heard of The Street, but it's my favorite book of the Harlem Renaissance. These are all examples of naturalism, which naturally African Americans picked up because and applied to their own writing in the 30s and 40s, because if there was any people in American culture that have been crushed by social government laws, social society, or anything in general, it's African Americans. And then modernism, it's even, well, it's not as bad, not as negative, but more limited to the mind, influenced by Freud and Jung. Modernist writers believed in self-reliance through the imagination only. So that's it. We see still in our culture today, if you look at the top row, of course, Rosa Parks, self-reliance, but also engineered by the Civil Rights Movement. Kerouac, the popularity of these figures have been used in advertising, even for the army, which is not at all individualistic, right? And the opposite, and yet they use it in their marketing. Or this UBU phrase, or YOLO, you only live once. These are elements of self-reliance still in our culture, and they're very popular. And there's two strains of self-reliance that have occurred since the 1800s. This is Ben, right here on the left, this is Ben Franklin's, this is the first political cartoon in the United States. Franklin wrote about a snake, a very strong but vicious animal that is cut up into states. And it's only by being self-reliant as a group that it could be strong. So that advocated for the uniting of the states. Rosie the Riveter, the women's movement, again, self-reliance as a group. The great symbols of American culture are the 13 colonies strong as one. Same here with all these United States. The Civil Rights Movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. These are strains of self-reliance, but for public good. Whereas there is also a thread of self-reliance that is embodied in this this snake. There's this snake and there's this snake. The rattlesnake was considered a very good symbol of American culture. It's native to the United States, but it's peaceful until you're aggressive, and then it lashes out. The way the eagle is facing the laurel wreath of peace, but has arrows just in case you mess with it. But that has been taken adopted by the Tea Party, and so that self-reliance means anything the government tells you what to do is wrong. So even wearing a mask, as surely you've noticed, there are some Americans who refuse to wear a mask because it impinges upon their civil rights. And that's just stupid, right? In my opinion. But this is what we get with self-reliance. It has a positive manifestations and also negative. So I think I'm right in an hour. Thank you for your time. And I'm also, this is my contact information here. If you want to write it down, it'll be available online too, and Christina can send it to you. But I'm going to stop sharing now because I'm out of time, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Sorry I took so much time, Christina.
No problem at all. Thank you, David. This was definitely more a college level lecture, which is completely okay. We have different speakers, and we warn our audience that every speaker has their own unique approach. If there are any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat window. Ask David. I don't see any questions at this moment. So I'll just draw attention to some of the links I shared. The presentation as well as the outline of this lesson and all the previous lessons can be found on the link I shared.
Christina, you're muted.
Sorry, I muted myself. So before we see any questions, I would like to ask you to complete the feedback form on the link I shared so that we know how you enjoyed today's lesson and how you enjoyed the lesson on Monday. Reminder for everyone, all the lessons we have already hosted are available on our YouTube channel, as well as on our YouTube, on our Facebook profile. And all the additional materials, presentations, as well as other outlines for these topics are available on the in the shared folder I shared via the chat window.
There seems to be one question, David. I'm not sure whether you saw it. How is self-reliance represented in Jazz Age?
Not very much, because in the Jazz Age, well, it is, if you're talking about Fitzgerald and Hemingway, that if you think of someone like Gatsby, there are these self-reliant characters who crash at the end, who are exposed as being too selfish and not fitting for the time. So we do get self-reliant characters. If you're talking about the white writers, if you're talking about the black writers, is the celebration of black writers led to this naturalistic movement against self-reliance, because black citizens were not able mostly to be self-reliant. So there's a lot of their writing during the Jazz Age was about society crushing black individuals. But usually when people say the Jazz Age, they mean Fitzgerald and Hemingway and those guys. So we do get this kind of remnant of self-reliant characters who go down at the end. They're admirable, but and distinctly American, but they seem to fail at the end, generally.
Well, I don't see any more questions. There are many thanks from the participants. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, David, for your wonderful presentation. And we look forward to seeing many of you at our next live lessons that will be focused on US geography and facts about the US in March. Dates to come soon, so please follow our website and our social media for updates. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.